team. Thank you for joining us for our third installment of This is Kellogg Spotlight on AI. Dean Francesca Cornelli will open with a conversation with our distinguished alumni panel and will address select audience questions throughout the program. We therefore encourage you to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. Today's presentation will last 60 minutes and it is being recorded. You can view today's recording and the previous two webinars in this series by visiting Kellogg's YouTube channel. Again, thank you for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Dean Cornelli to get us started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I hope you and your family are all staying well and safe during this time. And I want to thank you for joining me virtually for the third and final event of the This is Kellogg series. Every quarter we will do a different topic. This quarter was a spotlight on AI. We launched with a panel about the new MBAI we just launched with the McCormick School of Engineering. That was really reaching out at the leaders to be able to integrate AI with the business. And then in the second session, we had a panel of Kellogg faculty talking about cutting edge research in the area. And today is our final event, and I'm really grateful to have three distinguished alumni. They're going to talk, they're industry leaders, and they can talk about the AI in their industry. So, and this is such a fantastic chance for me to also showcase what a broad range of alumni in every area we have. Whatever we look at, we have experts and leaders in every area. So we have Bob Gamgort, who is the chairman and CEO of Keurig Dr. Pepper, Charles Kuai, who is the co-founder and corporate SVP of Cerence. I hope it said that Cerence is correct, Charles, yes. And is also president of the Mobility Solution and IoT Technology Division and the Greater China region. And then Annette Rippert, who is the Group Chief Executive of Strategy and Consulting, Accenture. So thank you all three of you, and thank you so much for taking the time and come here. I hope you read the bio that when you register, that they're amazing bios, but I want to keep all the time to start immediately you ask question. Now, if you've taken part in some of these events before, you know, you can start putting question in the Q&A box immediately, and I will, depending on when is the topic touch, I'll weave them in with the question, with the other question I'm planning to ask. So putting question at any time. Now, let me ask you one question, which is, you know, this is the theme of which I have started basically any panel, any interview, any conversation I had since March 2019, which is we've gone virtual, largely virtual everything, 9 months now, right? So what surprised you about, you know, how company had to use AI in this world of virtual? Is there something that surprised you particularly? And what is it? Who wants to start? Bob, can I start with you?
Absolutely. Good to be here this evening. So look, I want to give the one caveat on AI and CPG upfront, consumer products goods, by the way, for CPG. And I would say that, you know, this industry is really at the very early stages of this. And so you'll get a glimpse at what the potential is to bring AI into a very standard industry like ours, but we're really in the foundation building stage, getting new sources of data, building in technology, incorporating algorithms to automate the way that we do our business practices, but very early days for us. I think for us, the CPG industry has been stable and predictable forever. I've been in it since I left Kellogg in '86. And we've been able to largely operate off of data that in some cases has a 2 to 4 week lag to it. You're talking about an industry that moves, you know, +5, -5% trends. COVID changed everything on that. And we saw the most dramatic changes in consumer behavior that I've ever seen in my career happen overnight. And we saw different retail channels and different category segments moved by numbers like plus 50, minus 70%. Swings that we've never seen before. And what we learned in the first week is that the data sources that we were using and the methodology we were using to forecast our business was way off. So we pulled together every piece of data source that we could. We created a daily demand model that didn't exist before. We have a panel of Keurig brewers that are in 10,000 households that give us point of consumption data. So we could literally see minute by minute changes. And then we had to feed that all into a supply chain model that wasn't designed to make those kind of swings. And we've been wildly successful at it. And so in short, when I wrap that all up, what I would say that surprised me most is that we could go from zero to a very sophisticated modeling and forecasting modeling and enterprise management system within weeks of COVID, really within days of COVID hitting, and completely changed the way we ran our business out of pure necessity.
It does resonate with our experience with the teaching, although it was probably simpler, but it was still also very surprising. Annette.
You know, I think a couple of things, and I'm going to pick up on the comments that you just made. But first of all, you know, if you think about what happened when the pandemic first took place, across the world, organizations were scrambling in order to be able to support their workforce. We all saw that. And I think one of the things that surprised me the most was the pace by which workforces were able to go virtual. And when you think about that, I think about my own organization. You know, we have more than 150,000 people who operate and help support clients whose own businesses were on the line and needed to be able to operate in a virtual environment. And I think the exceptional thing was that in 3 days, 150,000 people were enabled with equipment, with network connectivity, and up and able. That's not actually the phenomenal thing. Throughout this period of time, you know, we have AI that's used to monitor networking connectivity, to monitor the security systems around these environments, to monitor the entire technical environment, but that's in a controlled environment, typically in a center, and now suddenly that is dispersed across a very broad and public network. And so the nature of all of those algorithms had to change in order to be able to support the health of that now virtualized environment. And I think what added to it was that there was a daily check-in with every employee, not only about their infrastructure, their network connectivity, their personal productivity, but their health and the needs that they had that were outside of, you know, what would be their technical environment. All of that was enabled through a series of bots. All of that was enabled so that people could spend their time instead triaging the real problem as opposed to worrying about the check-in on the people. So this might seem simplistic, but when you think about the order of magnitude and the businesses that are riding on that connectivity, it was so important. And I think if I pick up on the other thing that surprised me was what you described just now about learning about data. And another CPG client that we work with had that very same thing in the most unusual parts of their business that established, that immediately saw spikes around different categories than they'd ever seen before. And I think that that whole point around what that means then to the supply chain and the foundation of data that supports the ability for any of those AI algorithms to be able to operate. Not only was the data they were using suddenly highly useless and had to be reestablished, but the algorithms themselves had to change. And the pace by which that was done, I think, is just such a testament to the speed of innovation that really can take place when necessity matters.
I agree completely. Charles, you're really in the thick of AI. What surprised you most?
Well, Francesca, you know, Cerence is a global leader in conversational and multimodality AI, and so we consider ourselves in the advanced tech. And one of the things we witness is we see the future and we try to make it reality today. And we sort of, initially was a spin out from Nuance Communications. So my comments are related to Nuance as well as Cerence. So we serve multitudes of industries, anywhere ranging from healthcare, financial services, mobility solutions, automotive, etc. They all move at different speeds. Some move faster, some move slower prior to pandemic. So for example, in telecommunications, which is an industry I was in for the first 15 years of my career, has moved faster because of digital transformation. But once the pandemic hit, it reminded me of SARS 1.0. I actually landed in Beijing in SARS 1.0, and I saw China leapfrog the retail business from traditional bricks and mortars straight to internet. And we saw this thing across the world. So we saw every company scrambling to do digital transformation. So no longer was the old hierarchy of how do we do digital transformation. They threw all the processes out and say, we must do digital transformation because the company went virtual. So people used to work and congregate inside a building and have meetings after meetings. Now they had to actually work remotely. And so what I'd like to call it is physically apart, but digitally connected. Physically apart, but digitally enabled. And probably the most outstanding example that I have seen is in the healthcare industry. So as we know, the pandemic had basically influxed so many patients into the hospitals and overloaded the hospital system. But at the same time, other illnesses and treatments were delayed because people were scared of going to the hospitals. So there was an explosion of what I call remote medicine. Okay, remote medicine in terms of physicians and patients interacting. And with remote medicine, how do you capture all the data records, do all the coding? So what I saw was a partnership between Nuance and Microsoft. They took the virtual assistants, which is the conversational AI engine that we kind of built together, and actually put it on Teams. So doctors and patients can talk. At the same time, you can basically take the entire infrastructure of the hospital and move it online. And that literally happened within a matter of a couple, 2 or 3 months. That would have normally taken maybe 2 or 3 years to actually process a project like such.
So actually, I have a question for all three of you, but let me start with you, with Charles. Charles, still we continue with you because it's a bit a continuation of what you're saying, like, what new uses of AI have emerged during the pandemic? I guess remote medicine was already there, but it exploded a lot. Other uses or, uses that will really reshape the business going forward.
Yeah, so for most of the people, they probably don't recognize artificial intelligence is as long as the science of computer science. So it's been in existence for 60 years. What has changed is that the fact is the world has gone what I call a software-defined world. So any business that we have, whether it's physical business, whether it's CPG, whether it's retail, whether it's hospital, it's software-defined. There's not enough software coders in the world to serve all the software changes. Machine learning development over the course of the last 10 years, it's economical and possible to actually tag the data, train the machine, and actually create new softwares for the services and the offerings. Where I saw is the maturity of voice AI and vision AI allowed many companies to start creating applications at lightning speed. An example of that is one of our clients is one of the world's largest rideshare companies. And suddenly rideshare, as you know, most of during the pandemic, people were worried about going into a car doing rideshare. So suddenly overnight, this is a tech company, by the way, suddenly overnight, they said, what can we do to solve this problem? It used to be rideshare maybe a year ago, safety during the journey was important. You don't want to have any female being attacked or male being attacked in the car. Overnight, suddenly hygiene and health was important. So we had to innovate extremely fast using computer vision and thermal monitoring. So a passenger walks into the car, you can actually thermally monitor their temperature so that you can actually do temperature screening while they're coming into the car. So we see a lot of applications across the multitude of the AI-enabled engines primarily voice, secondarily vision, and other modalities.
Very interesting. Annette, you supervise a lot of, you advise a lot of companies. What new uses have you seen emerging?
Well, I think that the point around the explosion on the utilization is such an important aspect. And when you think about AI being used in the ways that, Charles, you just spoke about, thinking about the explosion of natural language processing, even to simple tasks that take place throughout the business process. And so when I think about that, I think about places, for example, where virtual agents have been used around natural language processing, now around visual processing. And if I think about simple actions, such as we've used this in consumer call centers in a very effective way for quite some time for retail purposes. That same technology now has been picked up and used across the world. We've implemented this, helping public agencies to be able to address questions coming in around COVID, to be able to address testing issues, to be able to address medical questions, and then to be able to administer other things such as public benefits that, if you remember when the pandemic first happened, many of the public agencies were backed up, unable to be able to support the volume of calls that were coming in to be able to provide benefits to people who needed them. These technologies completely expedited that entire process to provide the social enablement that was necessary.
Thank you.
Francesca?
Yes, please.
I would like to add one small minor thing is as an example of the speed of change, just to demonstrate to our audience. So the COVID peak at March, all of us were worried about touching elevators. And every day I go down and I send my son to the school. He's 9 years old. We have an argument. Do you touch or don't touch the elevator? One day he turned to me in March. He said, if you're that smart, why don't you invent an elevator you can boss around and not boss me? So that actually inspired me to create an elevator that you can talk to. Literally, you know, the elevator business, which we call a building mobility, moves very slowly. And literally over 3 weeks, we invented the first world conversation. Fast forward this, now the elevator companies are beginning to see the value of this. So imagine what we've taken is in the automobile business, as you're driving towards Kellogg, if it's raining, it says, find me a parking nearby. Because it's raining, it won't give you the parking, a surface level. It's underground. Same application can happen in a 40-story building. If you're in the 40th story and say, take me to the first floor, and it's raining, it should remind you, please take an umbrella with you. So these are the innovations and the speed and the value that a lot of our clients are recognizing and learning at hyper speed.
I look forward to that because I'm always forgetting umbrellas or going to the wrong floor. So and it's amazing what's happening. Bob, what about we were saying, what other trends have you seen emerging, uses?
Yeah, I love hearing these stories because we have consistent experience here. The story that I told before about speeding up our access to data and then matching it in a different way with our supply chain. As I said, that was done out of necessity, but that will continue in the future because it is the right way to run the business. There's another area which is about employee health, safety, attendance that has come in waves as being an issue for us as well. Because if you think about it, we have a essential business. 21,000 of our employees could never work from home. They had to be in plants and in the retail stores delivering product. And so we had to put in place systems to be able to track where they were, to monitor their health, to screen them in advance. And again, I think that will stay. But I actually think the biggest piece that will stick post-COVID for food and beverage is e-com. And I remember sitting in a CEO conference, it was like 10 years ago. And most of my peers did not believe that food and beverage would ever have a meaningful sale channel through e-com. And I remember thinking at that time that I can't believe that we're going to be the only segment that isn't impacted by this. And here it is 10 years later, where it got accelerated by at least 5 years. in this situation here where people really learn to have the food and beverages delivered to their home, and they love it. And it's something that's going to continue as we go forward. And that gives us a completely different way to market and sell to our consumers than we had before.
I want to ask one question to Annette. As beginning your support in the company, how have you seen companies implementing AI? I'm interested because also it's related to what we are launching the new MBAI, right? Exactly. How do you implement AI in a company?
And I think that this takes form in so many different ways. But I think, starting at the very top, there has always been this point of being able to improve fundamental business process. Fundamental business process leveraging as we think about the enablement of whether it's bots or components that will help to expedite routine tasks. This is fundamental and maybe just the foundation. But now what we see is the intelligence of AI being used to do things that are well beyond the ability of a human. So if we think about, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, we're working together with Google and one of the leaders in the pharmaceutical industry on a platform called Intient. And the Intient platform is focused on being able to derive the data, using the data that is derived out of the R&D process to really help expedite the kinds of solutions that now it is so apparent that we need within our environment that could never be done at the level of complexity without being able to use significant amounts of data that's gained through trials, through being able to see, we all understand the complexity of the R&D process that's here, but without being able to analyze that data at that rate and depth, this takes time. And we're seeing this now through the pharmaceutical companies who are coming forward with solutions, unable to be able to do that without using AI. So when we start to take a look at the power of this, it's so clear, just like we talked about, some of these changes now are evident. They've been accelerated. They'll continue forward in the future business process of the organization because we won't go back. And I think that's one of the most significant things, that this acceleration of innovation has put us into a position where we won't go back. And it's clear how quickly we can innovate. And so the use of data throughout the organization now, what I see, if we go from that rote implementation of business process to the acceleration of intelligence and analysis, now we're able to take that kind of information. It's used for the acceleration of marketing. It's used for the acceleration of understanding customer patterns. It's used for the acceleration of understanding the manufacturing process, of looking at disruptive supply chains now. So we have very active activities going on in the supply chain arena around the disruption that's taken place, and the ability to analyze the complexity of the alternatives in the supply chain now is significant. And you can see where that would have been a project that would have taken years to put into place, because it was needed under the circumstances of COVID, has happened so rapidly. And I think those are the examples of every part of the business is now being enabled by the foundational understanding of the data, harnessing the data and being able to apply applied intelligence, apply artificial intelligence across all of that.
Thank you. And I think I see a question here that actually is kind of, like a progression. It says, what obstacles have you encountered? I guess it's for all of you, whoever want to answer, in adoption of these technologies, especially AI. How have you managed these challenges, and did you find any intractable?
I'll start. I'll just say, I think that the very first challenge that comes to be apparent is the underlying data sets that are available within the organization, because the ability to really be able to apply AI is foundationally based around the quality of the data. And we talk now about the timeliness of that data, like we talked about at the opening of the discussion, I think is so relevant to the fact that Now data is such a strategic resource within the enterprise that now we have to be able to support the pace and the volume by which organizations now want to have it available in each one of those different business processes I was talking about before.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of COVID was the normal resistance to change, and the question of, do we really need to implement new sources of data? Do we really need to speed up the supply chain? Went out the window very quickly. And so there's always a good side to a crisis, and then a lot of resistance goes away. So we actually had great acceptance of the change because it was a sign that we could do things differently in a crisis, and people rallied behind it. But I think if we had tried to do this at this speed under normal circumstances, there would have been significant resistance.
So I see, Francesca, I agree with Annette and Bob, but I see there is some obstacles in terms of data globally that are different stages. So some countries have stricter regulations like Europe, and in some industries like in the US, in healthcare, they have stricter regulations. The regulations itself, in terms of privacy, protection, as well as reliability, will have to evolve. If that doesn't evolve, I think it will create asymmetrical advantages for certain markets and countries that have a more progressive regulations towards what I call data supply chain. Okay, so let's think of it as if data today is the crude oil of 100 years ago. If you are not able to really build refineries and cars very quickly, you cannot really use that. So be able to do data drilling, data monetization, data processing, data sets. I cannot imagine. I think it's a huge advantage for certain countries. And so I think that would be part of the conversation, ongoing public-private partnership. How do you actually enable that data to be harnessed?
Thank you. And I see here another question. I can see now a lot of questions arriving. How do companies decide which AI project to select for implementation? I don't know.
Well, maybe I could try to answer this. And as a start, I think traditionally, it's a return on investment. So traditionally, what they've used is, if I automate, do I save money? And now what we've started seeing, it's not just a cost advantage, but a revenue advantage. So because of the automation that's needed, you're able to actually transact to a larger set of customers. Virtual assistants, like Annette was describing, in the past was based on, how do I basically reduce the cost for a phone call, to process your phone call? Today, because there's an explosion of multi-channels coming on as an onslaught to the enterprises, they found that you can't actually hire enough call center reps because of COVID now. So you have to leverage this technology to accelerate revenue extraction. So it's moved from a cost advantage to a revenue advantage. But there has to be an overall plan and strategy. But I think that's the major difference between choices of projects to take or not to take by industries.
I think that's such an interesting point, because one of the immediate things that we saw, if you think about the fact that the world shut down retail, those retail channels where people would visit, when they were closed down, presented a pretty big problem for organizations who didn't have an alternate way to get their product out into market. And so if I use just one example, major communications provider that we work with had to suddenly figure out, how do I support all the activities that I would be supporting in my retail location? And when you think about it, communications is of the essence when we're in the midst of something so difficult as a pandemic. So questions that they would have been addressing that would have been around customary actions of billing, customer service, now were much more prevalent around fulfillment and self-provisioning, because if I could no longer go to a retail store to have my phone provisioned for someone to help me load my data on it, I had to be able to make that up through a virtual discussion with a call center rep. And To be able to retrain people is quite difficult, but to be able to put virtualized services within those centers to be able to handle that interaction and offload all of that new additional call volume that had to have completely different dialogue sets, that's the way to allow the retail channel to continue to progress and now deal with new issues of people who are struggling financially, can't pay their bills, need to be able to extend their service because this is the lifeline upon which they need to survive. So it was a very different change in the foundation of the business that was enabled by the fact that they had AI deployed in that center and then needed to completely flip its function.
Oh, thank you. This is getting so interesting. I have a question for Bob now. Do you have an example of how you use AI to do predictive analytics it's a long question, sorry, to rapidly predict consumer shifts, or perhaps to predict how customers consume advertising to adapt your tactics in that area? And you mentioned perfect, yes, sorry.
Yeah, there's a number of areas in which we can use it within consumer products. I think you think about precision marketing, which is what you're talking about. Historically, we would market to demographic segments. It wasn't very precise. Now we're able to get it down to a almost an individual level. And I think Charles' point about privacy becomes very important in this case because we have more flexibility in the US than there is in Europe to be able to do that. We're able to sell direct to consumer. And then we're also able to now take it a step further, as I said, and start to model what we believe the shifts in consumer demand are going to be by collecting all of this data and then reorienting not only the supply chain, but innovation against that. And I'll give you one example of something that we used within COVID, but it'll be expanded beyond that. And that is, a lot of the theme that has come up today is we need better data. And for years, we've been trying to get closer to the consumer in the way that we manage the business. Now, when I got out of Kellogg, we managed the business on shipment data. So our shipments to retailers. Then we were able to get retailer warehouse withdrawals. Eventually, we got to point of sale scanner data. We thought that was as good as we could get, but the dream was always to get point of consumption data. And I mentioned before that we have a panel of 10,000 connected brewers and households. We are the first to get point of consumption data in CPG. We get literally as a Keurig cup is brewed, we know exactly what was brewed. We know which household it was in. We know the demographics of that household and also what they purchased beyond our products. And we're able to match this all together and come up with an incredible algorithm about what's happening in homes. And you can imagine, if I take that learning back to what happened in COVID, if we waited for shipment data to see the surge in demand, it would have been 2 to 3 weeks and we would have lost a lot of production time. We saw it within hours of the shutdown and we started turning on our production way before we got the orders. In fact, about a week into it, our supply chain team was getting nervous that they were building all this inventory, yet no orders were coming in. And we kept saying the orders will come. And then we started calling our partners up because we do the manufacturing for partners like Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and Peet's Coffee as well. And they were running off of shipments. And we called them up and said, you have to put orders in right now. This surge is coming. And when it came, people were just stunned that we were able to see it so far in advance. So I think that's a really early glimpse of where we can go. But imagine if you can get point of consumption data, what you're able to do in terms of anticipating demand, satisfying consumer needs, matching your supply chain up. One of the things that we have, for example, from a consumer benefit standpoint, is we have a Pandora or Spotify-like feature, which is if somebody consumes these 5 coffee varieties, we know what other coffee they're going to like. So we can say, based on your consumption pattern, you should try this coffee. Or if we want to sample something, we know which households to send it to. So it's early days, but this is the stuff that gets us really excited.
Very interesting. And talking about different industry, Charles, how do you recommend that leaders in one industry think creatively about borrowing AI ideas from other industries?
Well, I think the first thing I recommend to every industry is to think of their consumers. Think of your customers and think of your business, whether it's a product, whether it's a solution, or whether it's a service. And then layer on top of that, As the world is moving to a software-defined world, how would you use the tool of AI to serve that? Just like maybe 20 years ago, computers started becoming relevant in the companies, and companies said, how do I use the computers to better provide services, experiences, and customers' solutions? Very, very important is think of the customer's experience first. So like Bob was talking about, which is at the end of the day, he's serving us with a great cup of coffee, which I'm just enjoying, or a great drink, Dr. Pepper. He needs to know, what am I gonna drink next? So it's not, he needs to know, what am I gonna wear next, because he's not in the apparel business, but the prediction of what Pandora has in terms of the experience that you wanna get can be applied in terms of consumption of a drink or a food. Layer on top of that, in AI, I recommend every executive to think of three things. You have to have a strategy for creating the consumer experience. You have to create a strategy, think of the customer's solution first, but underneath that, you have a pillar of three. One is computing, one is algorithms, one is data. Computing, I think everybody's already up to speed because there's a lot of developments in GPUs and NPUs and so on and so forth. Algorithms is really centered around two things, classification and prediction. I cannot emphasize how important data is. Data, you have to think of it as a supply chain issue. You have to think of it, how do you take the massive data you have, refine the data, extract the key data, give it to the data scientists to actually provide the improvements to your service and your product, and the cycle goes on and on and on, and iteration. So whichever company makes it as an AI strategy first, I think in the next 5 to 10 years will be a very, very successful company.
And talking about that, Annette, when you talk with clients, what common misconception you hear from the business leaders about AI, and what do you think should be their basic understanding that is necessary?
Well, I think that if we were thinking before pandemic, if I were thinking about what kind of issues, there was often the concern about the mystery of AI, or the fact that would I be concerned that AI would displace people in my workforce. And I think one of the things that we talked about, that we talk about as an organization, is really something that we look at. There's human-based activities, there are machine activities, and then there are activities that are sitting in the middle. We call this something the missing middle. And when we think about that, there's really this confluence of how technology is changing the human opportunity, the job, the role, the performance within the organization, and really how the organization itself will interact when we think about how technology is changing the nature of the business itself. And so, this concern around displacement of roles, I think what's most important when we think about the broader implications of that is thinking about how there's new opportunity, new roles that are created as a result of man and machine being coupled together. And so the focus on how to reskill the workforce, how to reskill into these new positions has really been an enabling force to diffusing that concern about the impact to the workforce in a negative way, but in fact then empowering the workforce to be able to take advantage of that technology. And I think that's one of the most important things when we think about broadly, well beyond AI, when we think about the impact of technology on an organization, is to think about the breadth of the workforce that sits within that organization and how to enable them to be able to be a part of the solution, a part of the innovation that really drives to the next generation of the business.
Actually, that brings me to another question, which is, how do you decide what is best done by computers, what is best done by human, or what is in partnerships? Any of you who has, I'm sure you all have a point of view.
I'll jump in because I'm going to build an example that's exactly like the one we just heard, which is, I'll shift over. I talked a lot about our coffee business. I'll talk about our cold beverage business. We run this very large direct store delivery network where our products are brought in by our employees on a daily basis to convenience stores and large stores. We do something like 16,000 stops per day. So it is a perfect environment for bringing in technology and AI, because it has been forever a manual decision by the individual who calls on that store to decide what's placed in that store, to write the order. It's all been done manually up until very recently. And so to show how the combination of the two works is, we started putting in predictive ordering. And so instead of the salesperson walking in, assessing the store, deciding where the gaps were and starting to write orders, we had them walk in with an order pre-written. And that was based on history, promotion scheduling, seasonality, even weather adjustments. And the skepticism was very high, as you can imagine. This can't possibly be right. And back to, again, to support another point, we actually had some concerns from unions. What are you going to do with this technology? Are you going to replace our people? And what we've seen is it's been an enabler for them, because they learned over time that the predictive ordering is really good. And
we have lost him. Well, we will get him. Maybe someone else can continue.
You know, I think I can give an example. That I'd love to give an example of an activity that I.
Yeah, that's okay. Keep going. I'll catch up. I didn't
No, please. I barely started. Go ahead.
Where did I lose you?
Well, just the last 2 minutes, 1 minute. You were saying, and now you lost. I was following. We lost you again. No, you're here.
Keep going.
I am. Okay, I forgot what you were saying when you got frozen.
Bob, you were talking about predictive with the labor union.
Ah,
Yeah,
yes, the predictive labor union, yes.
Unions were concerned we're going to use it to replace their jobs, and we didn't. It really, they found out that they were able to do more value-added work, and a lot of this is on commission, so they actually earn more money as a result of that. But the reality of it is, if you think about it, there's no way any human could keep all of those variables in their head and make a decision. That's why it's a perfect partnership between what is the value-added contribution for humans matched up with computers being able to enable them to make better decision-making.
Annette, you were giving an example, sorry.
I was, you know, now with the advent of COVID, we all understand the impact that COVID has on the body, on our lungs, on our respiratory systems. And at Accenture, we had worked together with a medical system in Italy in order to evaluate how, with the use of AI and the ability to use visualization, improve the accuracy of each one of those X-ray images. And it was just recently, I think maybe a week ago, that there was an article published, in fact, about Northwestern working on a new AI platform that detects COVID-19 by analyzing those same X-ray images. And I think that this just shows the fact that as we think about innovation, that algorithm in the article that was covered outperformed the team of the specialized thoracic radiologists. And the significance of the reading of that, it was not statistically significantly more. What was so important was that it allowed then for the doctors to be able to help support the outcome, the validation, and the time difference. I believe that it said it was 10 times faster. Obviously, it was automated, 10 times faster to be able to get to that similar or slightly better accuracy rate. And really, when you think about the future of things like medicine, that's it would be one of those steps you would never go back. And I think it's an example of, you know, in these many ways where there are choices. Did we worry then about the radiologists being without a position? No. We worry then about how do we take the radiologists and allow them to do so much more within the medical system with that enhanced information and data.
Francesca, can I add to that? So I think if at different stages of AI, we got to think about that question differently. So today where AI is, I think it's relatively mature, ready for what I call classification problems, natural language processing, computer vision. Reasoning and creativity and decision-making prediction is still very, very nascent. So one of the things we did recently was to say, okay, we have many examples like radiologists, union workers. Since this is an MBA event, a Kellogg event, we invented something in China we call voice cloning for our business in China. That was very, very well accepted inside China, where people, instead of sending emojis to each other, they would send, think of your emoji with your voice being cloned. So like, for example, I love you, and then it has your emoji, sends it across. So it's a funny thing. When it came to the US, there was some spookiness to this. Then we said, really, what we should do is to prove that how we can make a job more interesting, right? A job more interesting. What is the most valuable job in any company? The most important job in any company? I think, Bobby, you will appreciate this. A CEO's job, right? All of us in this MBA with Kellogg, we want to aspire to become CEOs. What is the most important, but yet rudimentary, basic, and probably as a CEO, you'd feel mundane activity you have to do every quarter is to read the prepared statements. But you love to get on these earnings call and have the conversation, the dialogues, and the reasoning. I think Bob is smiling. He probably would agree with that. So recently for Cerence, we've cloned our CEO and CFO's voice, and you can listen to our earnings call. The prepared statement was completely done by neural nets, voice cloned, so the entire prepared statement. And then that allowed the CEO and the CFO to be relaxed, enjoy the meeting and the conversation, energized that they have a great earnings call. So they're focused on answering the questions and answers of the earnings call with the analysts, which is what the creativity and the insightfulness for the top executives in the company. Just as an example, Francesca, you can listen to our earnings call.
That's very interesting. I can see a lot of CEOs immediately following that. Let me see. I see at least 3 questions here in the box about unintended bias that AI brings, right? So I just want to ask you all, how do you manage this unintended bias, or generally, what ethical question have you grappled with in terms of deploying AI?
I could try to answer that. So we work today with 60% of the automotive companies. Out of every 10 cars shipped, 6 ships with our technology. And in the automotive industry, 4 major disruptions are happening: connectivity, shared, autonomous, and electric. Autonomous is the area that I've been focused on quite a bit. So cars are being connected. So you've probably seen some recent automobile companies are linked to insurance companies. They're extracting data to better predict, to better underwrite risks. The questions that I started having with some of our automobile partners as well as insurance partners is an ethical question. It's a what if. It hasn't happened, but what if? So if there is a world where cars become autonomous, and God forbid there's a situation where you have to make a decision because you will have to hit one of 2 people crossing the pedestrian. There's an ethical boundary between the insurance company and the automobile company. If that ethical boundary is blurred, you can imagine a world, negative world, where you would hit the person with the least claim cause. And that would not be good. So I think when it comes to machines, how do you make sure that the machine's bias is random, but not biased based on financials, like what I talked about, insurance, or racial or other categories? Because at the end of the day, the algorithms are trained by humans. And that's where one of the biggest ethical challenges we will have facing our industry as a whole. But the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. But we have to just keep that in the back of our mind.
Anyone else? No?
I mean, the applications that we're using don't put us anywhere near that category that Charles just talked about, fortunately. which was fascinating to hear that one. So for us, our biggest concern is really just about privacy and security and any applications we have, and especially if we capture any data that's identifiable at the consumer level or at the employee level. But that's a much lower level of concern than what we're talking about here.
Now, let me ask you another question, which is, you know, Charles talked before about differences in regulation among countries. But in general, do you notice a difference across culture or geographies in terms of how people relate to AI and how you navigate that? Let me start with Annette. Maybe your consulting companies, very different type of companies.
I think that the speed and acceptance of AI and technologies broadly can be seen in the rate of adoption. And so, you know, I think clearly there are accelerating parts of the world who've really been focused around the acceleration of AI. If you think about from a governmental policy standpoint to support of innovation, both from government programs and other investments, we can see that acceleration focused in, for example, when we think about geographies such as China, highly differentiated from areas that are focused on broader-based concerns related to areas that you spoke about with regard to the protection, the necessary, perhaps we would say, in the United States, the necessary protection of aspects of sensitive data, et cetera. So I think that when we look at, there are indeed differences that are based around cultural norms, that are based around governmental related, both incentive and protections. And that, I think, over time, when you look at organizations such as ours who work with clients, we're global and our clients are global, and looking at the innovative capacity of different aspects of, you know, what is available in different geographies. I think that what it comes down to really is not only a geographic emphasis, but a cultural one. When you look at the position that organizations themselves take on how they want to be able to leverage technology and where they find themselves on that continuum.
If there are, if nobody, I have a question here. I see we are getting towards the end, and you know, at Kellogg, we always talk about leadership is the defining things of the trip of the, you know, journey that the students have throughout. So I see here a question about what do you think the implication of AI are on organizational structure, leadership, and decision making? You can take any of all the, you know, this is a large things, but it is true, right? How does it make a difference? How do you feel?
Yeah, from my standpoint, I think it flattens out the organization significantly. It empowers people to make decisions closer to the front lines, whatever those front lines are. And I think it's a great equalizer to be able to be empowered to actually break away from a lot of these hierarchical decision structures and really go much more to making the decisions in the moment at the right point in time. So I see it as ultimately pretty empowering.
Anybody else has a?
I would so agree with this point, and I think it unlocks innovation because it allows, you know, there's a time when the hierarchy of an organization is based on access to information. And now as we take and make information and the ability to implement it much more readily accessible throughout the organization, I agree completely on the point around empowerment. And in fact, I think alleviating, you know, we talked before about the elimination of mundane duties and really being able to accelerate the development of the individuals within an organization so that they can contribute in a way that's really providing greater value to the organization.
It's I echo with Annette and Bob. I think it's AI created a platform of what, you know, at Kellogg we've learned is the phase 5 of the organization, where it went from a function to a region to a matrix to smaller teams. So the smaller teams are working together on a common cause purpose across the same data set. And then with AI, as a CEO, you're able to kind of link all these small teams in a very efficient way for the common cause of the whole company. So it's a platform that accelerated the evolution of the organization phase 5 and beyond. And as leaders, it's very important to explain to the organizational leaders that you have to share the data across the organization. And we have to think of the organization very differently than what we traditionally perceived as the organization being siloed either regionally or functionally, but rather as teams of people working together in a collection of, like Bob was talking about 10,000 breweries. They got to be 10,000 teams in a company as well.
Now, I can see a question. I do apologize to all the participants that are sending more. Maybe I will send all of them to the panelists today. But I think we are out of time. The time flew, and your contribution was fantastic, and the range of topics and ideas were really amazing. So thank you so much for bringing your perspective. And I saw so many commonality and the way you were thinking. And I'd like to think is the Kellogg spirit across all of our alumni that say in this way. So thank you so much for being such an amazing panelist. I apologize I couldn't take everybody's questions. We will continue the This is Kellogg series in January. In the winter quarter, we're going to have 3 events that will be focused on the theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we'll send out information in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, Annette, Bob, and Charles, thank you so much. Thank you for expertise and what you brought. And thank you, everybody, for connecting. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.